I dare say every member of this audience thinks about the meaning of life. You think about the meaning of life anytime you consider an important decision about how to live. Thinking about the meaning of life is reflection on how one ought to live. Many of you in the audience are young. Probably you've been trying to decide what to do in the future that awaits you. You may be asking yourself questions like, what career to take on? Should I have children? Where should I make my home? What should I do for my community? How should I contribute to the world at large? I'm sure the older members of this audience have pondered these same questions at one time or another, and some of these questions may still be on your minds and driving you crazy. Fundamentally, these are all questions about how one ought to live. The fact that we ask such questions of ourselves shows that the answers cannot be arrived at arbitrarily without thought or reason. And so, in thinking about how to live, we search for values that enable us to make the best decisions we can. But where do values come from? Do they even exist? In the time I have, I want to argue that there are values for living that make some lives good lives. There are values for living that make some decisions in life better than others. Indeed, there are values for living that make life worth living at all. There are a number of competing perspectives on the meaning of life. One perspective is called nihilism. Nihilism is the proposition that values do not exist. Therefore, in this view, there are no values that make it true that you ought to live one way rather than another. Indeed, if nihilism is correct, there would not even be any values that make life worth living in the first place. To imagine a true nihilist, I invite you to picture the Joker, Batman's arch enemy. Joker's memorable line from the film The Dark Knight is, do you remember? "Why so serious?" Joker mocks the other characters with this question because he doesn't think that there is anything worth taking seriously. "Why so serious?" the Joker growls, because he doesn't recognize any values that make anyone's life, not even his own life, significant in any way. Why so serious? Joker's worldview is devoid of any values, so he plots to steal, kidnap, murder, and torture. Might as well, he must think it makes him laugh. Nihilism is an unsettling proposition. I don't think we should accept it, but it does still raise a hard problem. If nihilism is not true, where can we find values to serve as criteria for how we ought to live? Another perspective, known as supernaturalism, holds that spiritual beings, namely God and the immortal souls he created, are the only sources of value for living. On the other hand, supernaturalism implies that if God does not exist, then nihilism has to be true. A well-known supernaturalist is the American philosopher William Lane Craig. Craig argues that life is absurd unless God exists and people have immortal souls. In a passage from his book, Craig notes that all life in the universe will eventually end in a great heat death trillions of years in the future. He then insists that a consequence of this must be, and I quote, that the life we live is without ultimate significance, ultimate value, ultimate purpose. A key premise in Craig's argument is that values for living exist only if life is eternal. But I see no reason to accept that premise. Even if life will end, there can still be values for living. Things can exist without being eternal, and values are no exception. Values for living may exist, if only as long as life itself exists. Also, some life decisions can have positive value in spite of the fact that their outcomes are not eternal. When I was a kid, I enjoyed friendships that sadly dissipated with time. The people you see here in this picture were my friends when I was 11, but no longer are. Those friendships ended, and yet my life was enhanced by them. Impermanent though they were valuable. Even if values for living could exist without existing eternally, that doesn't mean they do exist. We still have to face the question of where values for living come from. I'd like to present a perspective that I think comes closest to the truth. This perspective has been called objective naturalism. It states that values for living exist, and they have two main features. First, according to objective naturalism, values for living are objective in the sense that they exist independently of any particular person or group's beliefs about value. Second, values for living are natural in the sense that they are not supernatural. Many proponents of objective naturalism are inspired by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Now, Aristotle's philosophy is wondrously complex, but the idea he had that inspires objective naturalism is simple. Roughly, it's the idea that values for living, the values which provide criteria for how we ought to live, are products of human nature. So, objective naturalism implies that even if the universe does not contain any gods or souls or spirits of any kind, there are values for living. Let's try to understand in more depth how objective naturalism explains the existence of values for living. According to objective naturalism, values for living are strategies that enable people to meet their vital human needs. Vital human needs are conditions that have to be met for human beings to function normally and maintain good health. Some vital needs are relatively simple, such as the vital needs for food and water, but other vital needs are much more complex. The psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan classify all vital needs into three types: needs for relatedness, needs for competence, and needs for autonomy. Vital needs for relatedness are needs to form bonds with others and experience feelings of security, belongingness, and intimacy. Vital needs for competence are needs to be successful in one's activities, to overcome challenges, and to master one's environment. Vital needs for autonomy are needs to do activities that one chooses and endorses for oneself. Objective naturalism says that the vital human needs and the conditions required to meet them are the subject matter of all values for living, all criteria for how we ought to live. If we humans didn't have vital needs, there wouldn't be any values for living at all. And this is why the correct values for living are strategies for effectively meeting the vital human needs. Going further, the values for living are both natural and objective. Since the vital needs are products of human nature, so are values for living. Also, it's an objective matter of fact that we have vital needs, and it's an objective matter of fact that there are strategies for meeting those needs. Therefore, it's an objective fact that there are values for living. Can we say anything more concrete about what values for living there are? Yes, we can. Values for living include narrative values. A narrative value is a theme or pattern in the story of a person's life. I'll briefly mention three narrative values: benevolence, courage, and independence. Benevolence is the stable commitment to helping others. Benevolence is a value for living because it meets the vital need for relatedness. Maintaining social bonds and a sense of connectedness to others requires being helpful. Courage is the ability to do something you know is difficult and dangerous. Courage is a value for living because it meets the vital need for competence. In order to succeed, one needs to endure hardships and take risks. Independence is the ability to act and think without being controlled by others. Independence is a value for living because it meets the vital need for autonomy. To have autonomy, you must be able to govern your own thoughts and actions. Before closing, I'd like to describe two real people whose lives express narrative values for living. A man who exhibits benevolence is Viktor Zhdanov, a Ukrainian virologist who died in 1987. After a passionate effort and over fierce opposition, Zhdanov persuaded the World Health Organization to start a campaign to eradicate smallpox. This goal was eventually achieved in 1977, making smallpox the first disease ever to be eradicated from the face of the earth. Zhdanov was never famous, and he never received any major awards for his work. However, because of his role in initiating the WHO's immunization campaign, he saved millions of lives. By a conservative estimate, supposing Zhdanov only caused the eradication of smallpox to occur 10 years sooner than otherwise, he would have saved between 10 and 20 million lives. A young woman who exhibits courage is Malala Yousafzai, a Pakistani advocate for women's and children's rights. In the early 2000s, the Taliban tried to take control of Pakistan's Swat Valley, where Malala and her family lived. They declared that no girls would be allowed to attend school, and they began to attack schools for girls. In response, Malala began speaking and blogging in defense of girls' basic right to an education. In 2012, when Malala was only 15 years old, she was shot in the head by a Taliban assassin. Remarkably, she survived with no major brain damage. And after recovering from her injuries, Malala continued to advocate publicly for all children's right to an education. In 2013, the Taliban issued yet another death threat against Malala. But she continued her work. At age 17, Malala became the youngest winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014, and in 2015, she opened a school for refugee girls from Syria. Now here we might imagine a nihilist raising various rhetorical questions. But where is the so-called value in Zhdanov's life? Where is the goodness in Malala's life? Why be so serious about all this talk of values? We might even imagine the nihilist looking up, down, and every which way to dramatize the point that values are nowhere to be found. No, where are they, right? Okay. But values for living can be detective. Okay? They're in the actions of people like Zhdanov and Malala, whose benevolence and courage satisfied vital human needs in extraordinary ways. Zhdanov's life was a good life by virtue of the lives he saved. Malala's life continues to be a life worth living by virtue of her commitment to making education accessible for everyone. So if you should ever feel tempted to lament the coming heat death of the universe and declare that there are no value criteria for how we ought to live, consider the vital needs that are going unmet in this world. Those needs are not spirits. They are concrete, urgent, alive, and all too mortal. From the domain of need, values for living are born, and they challenge us to act. We must be so serious about values because our happiness, our freedom, our health, and our very survival demand that we live up to them. Thank you very much.